Afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a Senior Associate and Planner with Roadside and Harwell, based in Alexandria, Virginia. But today, for this webinar, I am facilitating a webinar for the Sustainable Communities Division of the American Planning Association. As you may or may not be aware, the APA Sustainable Communities Division supports planners who are committed to planning for sustainable communities by integrating all aspects of sustainability into our work through the combined economic, social, and ecological factors that shape our communities. And so webinars are one way that we provide education to our members and to others. You don't have to be a member to be on the webinar today, but we're happy if you are. I'll say up front, if you're having any issues seeing the slides or hearing me, just feel free to let me know via the chat function on any meeting, and I will work on getting you connected in a few minutes once we finish our introduction here. So as always, I want to start off the webinar by acknowledging our sponsors. We're very grateful to these organizations who help us put on events such as this webinar and other upcoming events that I'll tell you more about in just a second. Our sponsors for 2018 to 2019 include Clarion, Criterion Planners, Dewberry, MC, Farr Associates, Half, Montgomery Associates, Niche Engineering, Planning Communities, Robinson and Cole, Smith Group, TESCA, the Urban Collective, the University of Florida Online Masters of Urban and Regional Planning, and Urban Works. So thank you again to all of our sponsors and to our division members whose contributions also support our work. If you're interested in the sponsorship for the upcoming year, which starts shortly in a couple of months here, feel free to contact Carla Ebenbach, who's the division secretary-treasurer. You can see her email there at the bottom of the screen. I'll also note that this webinar is currently being recorded, and we will be posting the slides and the recording on our blog site, which you see listed here. If you're interested in learning more about our past webinars or learning about future events, you can go to the blog and you can see a list of all of our events there. If you're interested in volunteering with the division or want to share ideas for webinars or activities, feel free to reach out, and we'd love to talk with you. If you're a student, I'll note that we have a student-focused webinar, so hopefully the first in a series of webinars coming up on April 9th, so check out the blog for that information. I will also let you know some exciting news about an upcoming event. I'm sadly not getting to San Francisco for the National Planning Conference this year, but I assume many of you on the call are. So I want to let you know that, make sure you're aware that we have a reception that we're planning with several other APA divisions and chapters, and tickets are going quite fast. I'm not just saying that. I promise I've been checking the sales and the tracking, and I think it'll be a really exciting event at the Spur Urban Center on Sunday, April 14th. So you might want to go take a look at that. We'll be announcing our award winners there, and it'll be some time just to chat with friends, make some new friends and connections, and have a couple of drinks and snacks. But on to today's event, which is called Reshaping Urban Environments for Disruptive Transport. We've got two speakers with us today. They'll be introducing more about themselves, I'm sure, but to give a brief introduction to both of them, Dr. William Riggs is a global expert and thought leader in the areas of future mobility and smart transportation, economics, design, and urban development. He is a professor at the University of San Francisco School of Management and a consultant and advisor to multiple companies and startups on technology, smart mobility, and urban development. His current position follows 2 decades of experience working as a planner, economist, and engineer. Among his other accomplishments, Dr. Riggs is the founder of restreet.com, which is an online tool for democratizing street design. I think you'll be hearing more about that in a bit. Our second speaker is Michael Johnson, who is Director of Urban Design at Smith Group. Michael's experience spans catalytic landscape architecture and urban design projects in major American cities, innovative campus plans for top urban research universities and Fortune 500 companies, and international large-scale mixed-use development efforts. Michael serves on the board of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, where he advances the measurable role that placemaking and urban design can play in fostering healthy cities and supporting landscape and streetscape performance. So as I noted, I'm sure you'll hear more as we go along. And if you have any questions while our speakers are speaking, please feel free to submit them via the attendee chat box. You can also use the Q&A function that's built into the system. Either way, we'll be taking a look at your questions and we'll address them at the end of the discussion. So feel free to shoot them along at any point as we go. Thank you all for joining us, and with that, I will pass it on to our speakers.
So, well, welcome to all of you. This is Billy Riggs, or William Riggs, professor at University of San Francisco, and really delighted that you can come and talk with Michael and I about one of the most exciting topics that we get to talk about as we think about the design of the built environment. And I'll just let Michael introduce him so you know his voice as well before we launch into our presentation.
Hey everyone, this is Michael. Really excited to be with you today, and we'll let Billy walk through the first few slides, and then I'll come back through the middle and talk a little bit, and then Billy will close it off before we answer your questions all within the next 50 minutes or so.
All right, great. Well, so again, we're going to talk today a little bit about disruptive transportation, and we've heard a lot about this in the news. And when I give talks, I like to start kind of with our traditional planning history class. And Michael and I go way back to Ball State University, where we were colleagues, and both of us were looking at urban planning and urban issues. And had we known that the future was not going to look like this beautiful Le Corbusier type vision here, and I'm being a little cheeky there, we may have chosen different careers. But we wanted to solve these kinds of problems, and we weren't, for many years, I think the vision of the future was something that was looking like this. This is actually from the 1936 World Fair, and this was actually one of the first visions of what would be a self-driving car. We don't usually see this vision. We usually see something that came from an energy company. I like to start earlier than that. We were talking about disruptive transportation, even in the back of in the era of horses and carriages. And this is a clip from the New York Times in the 1890s. So the idea that we would talk about data-enabled travel, and travel that really was optimized and could conduct itself while we engaged in other activities, is not something that's new. This is the stereotypical image that we see from a lot of presenters. I think the unique factoid about this, there are two factoids. One is that kind of emphasizing that they're not engaged in the driving act, and they're not engaged in something that's been part of our culture for over 80 years. But the interesting factoid that I like to point out is this was actually not from a OEM or a vehicular manufacturer, and that's the acronym that we use many times for vehicular manufacturers. This was actually from an energy company, and so I do think that as we look at this, maybe there are different synergies that we can or different lessons that we can take from this type of this, that the importance of energy going forward is something that we should dialogue. And that's something that maybe we can talk more about in the question and answer. Now, clearly, just with regard to the built environment and autonomous vehicles, we've seen different iterations of this going forward. And I'm just going to scroll through some visions. This is the latest vision of what an autonomous vehicle is being thought of as. This is the Waymo vehicle right outside my backyard in Mountain View, California. But we don't know what the final implications of this technology will be. Tesla has a very unique vision and a somewhat controversial vision in their car, which many people assume can drive itself. But autopilot still has a long way to go. when we talk about this, this is a graphic from, and I'll refer many times to the APA Planning Advisory Services report that was recently published, and I was one of the authors of that report, and that's available if you're an APA member through the APA website. This is kind of looking at in terms of autonomy, what the future might look like from various vendors, and you see there Tesla and Waymo as two of the kind of the leaders in trying to develop these types of vehicles that drive themselves. But we also have BMW, Ford, Fiat, Chrysler, Hyundai, and we could actually add to that list now, even since the publication of our report. So, I actually like to kind of show this humorous picture of the DeLorean in reference to the movie Back to the Future, in talking about that we have an evolution of vehicles and an evolution of travel that, if you look at markets, really parallels this idea of the cell phone. When the iPhone was introduced, it was a series of progressions from what we used in the late 70s and the early 80s, these large phones that occupied large segments of space in our car. And we've seen that gradually evolve. And we're seeing the same thing in transportation from a vehicular standpoint, but also we're seeing the vehicle evolve. I like to many times say that the future that we predict is never the future that we predict. And I think we're seeing more and more a trends towards even what we call personal mobility. And that can be everything from what we saw in 2018 with the advent of motorized scooters in many of our cities, to some of these visions of personalized transit, or PRT, or some of the visions we're seeing in downtown Detroit with May Mobility, where we have self-driving shuttles occupying things. So not kind of this vision that you're seeing in the bottom left of your screen of the Mercedes privately owned vehicle. So I think that's a good way to contextualize where we are. But I think we also can't take anything for granted. In Europe right now, and particularly in Munich, we're seeing a lot of nudging towards flying vehicles and autonomous aerial taxis. There's also in the U.S., particularly in the middle part of the U.S., and been a lot of dialogue about Hyperloop. And I say HSX because that references high-speed rail initiatives in the UK. And so there's a lot of dialogue over whether or not rail may be a disruptive factor in the future. And clearly, it's not just about the car. And I think that and many of you have probably had to grapple with these new dockless bike systems that compete with what we originally thought were going to be our original bike share systems. And those are both, an opportunity, but they also present many challenges. And I think that this is, as we think about what these types of vehicles, what autonomy and what data-driven and disruptive transportation mean to our communities, it's important that we consider all the optimistic as well as pessimistic futures. We in kind of academia kind of talk about these as yin yang or heaven hell, but I think that there are a lot of questions here, and if we don't speculate and if we move away from kind of guessing, at the end of the day, we can identify kind of subject areas. And what I like to focus on is this idea that we may have less vehicle ownership. We may have reduced infrastructure, reduced parking needs, potentially less commodization of vehicles, more time for leisure, for human connectivity, more accessibility, less VMT. But all this is potentially an optimistic perspective. There could be a pessimistic view, and I think this is where we have people on both sides of this debate. But at the end of the day, I think what you'll hear from us today is really something that focuses on our certainties. I sometimes like to distill those down to the certainties are that the built environment will still exist. We still live in space. So we still have to design things, and we still have to behave in a way where we need to travel. So the act of travel still needs to occur. and we still have a built environment that we must pass through. And those, irrespective of any speculation, illustrate kind of things that planners can really focus on, whether or not it's heavy or fixed rail, or light rail, or whether or not it's providing infrastructure for biking and walking, or whether or not it's kind of focused on these critical factors that many of our cities deal with. I think that one of the things that, and this is a graphic that comes from the PAS report that I referenced earlier that's available on the APA website. We know that there will be safety implications. It's likely that there will be air quality benefits and improved mobility, but there some of these things could go either way. There may be equity implications as we see more and more advancement of technology, as we see more privatization of our urban transportation systems. And I think these are all things that planners and landscape architects and architects really have an opportunity to nudge society in a direction that is positive. I've given a lot of talks at places, and I usually ask people, what are the 3 words that they hope that our future streets will look like? And the interesting part, and we can toggle between this slide and the next type, is that if we look at what people hope our streets will be and what they fear that they will be, at the end of the day, they map very clearly to what planning community and the landscape architect community would describe as our ideals. That there's that we hope to have streets that are green, that are safe, that are accessible and walkable, that are pedestrian oriented, that facilitate movement. And in the same way, looking at safety and congestion and noise, pollution, those are the kinds of things that when people look at these, that people articulate their vision for future streets, they're exactly the things that we wouldn't focus on as a planning community. So I think those are important formative factors, and they really pivot us to kind of talking about, okay, from a planning community, what can we do to design within this market-driven evolution of space? And so with that, I want to turn it over to Michael, who's going to talk a little more about kind of from a physical design standpoint, what does this mean? And he's going to talk about a couple cases as well. Thanks,
Billy. Yeah, I think what Billy's laid out is a really solid framework for a conversation for all of us to have as planners, as designers, as urban advocates, and as citizens in cities that we live in. And I think to emphasize some of Billy's last points, having an honest conversation about some of the design and planning implications in this time of uncertainty as it relates to the technology. I think one of our main points of this presentation, and a presentation that I think we all need to continue to have in our communities and in our walks of life, is that now is the time for cities to be honest about these conversations, to anticipate some of the disruptive technologies now and into the future, and to rapidly innovate as it leads to some urban policies and designs that shape streets to facilitate the type of behavior that we want to see in our cities, and the kind of outcomes that we want to have in our cities. And so, regardless of different walks of life and opinion, I think this idea that cities are falling behind in kind of policy as it relates to autonomous vehicles and transportation, you can't really argue that, because less than 10% of U.S. cities have even devoted planning resources to talking about on-demand transportation services like Uber and Lyft, let alone self-driving vehicles. And so the time is now. And as we have those kind of honest conversations and lead some of these dialogues in our cities, Billy and I are advocating for these conversations to take place in cross-disciplinary ways. In many ways, the way that Billy practices and the way that I practice blurs the boundaries between academia and professional practice. It blurs the boundaries between landscape architecture and urban planning and design and transportation planning. And we think that all of these kind of different ways of thinking are required. And so these are just a few guiding principles that we'd like to put forward, for discussion with you all today as we have these conversations. And so one of those principles is that, make sure that we're being advocates to leading with autonomous transit and ensuring that we are pushing the advancing of new technologies and new partnerships, even ideas that consider transit agencies as mobility brokers to ensure that we're not just getting more of the same as we lead with a conversation about what autonomy means in our cities. It's very clear, it's been clearly publicized that one of the biggest impacts to our urban streets and even suburban streets are that our design and policy thinking has to rethink how we use the curbs and begin to design streets to encourage more rapid transition to the kinds of mode splits that we want to see in our cities, ensuring that changing curb demands and parking implications are at the forefront of our mind, in addition to deliveries and other things like that. This is the graphic on the screen is from a recent study conducted by Uber in San Francisco. Farron Piers, some folks worked on that, and some of their guiding principles I think were pretty interesting, and ensuring, again, these are kind of no-brainer kind of things that we all think about, but again, in the context of this kind of extreme uncertainty around the technology, I think they resonate, right? Give priority to pedestrians and bicycles and transit riders, emphasizing smaller and fewer lanes, minimizing conflicts and crossing distances, utilizing curbside flexibility, and restricting speeds. And I think, one of the things that Billy and I have been talking about, and Billy has really led in some of his research, is the focus on reducing speeds as a real important notion for all of our conversations. Another design and policy implication that we need to be talking about are congestion pricing. Certainly can point to successful rules about pay as you go, pay how you go, that accounts for congestion surge and even the land use implications. Certainly some leadership in London and Stockholm that has been quite successful, that begins to not only emphasize pricing for road use, but dedicating some of that revenue towards incentivizing alternate modes. Just read in the New York Times this morning that New York City, right? So
yeah, go ahead.
You read the New York Times too? Yeah,
oh, dang it! Yeah, so, I do read.
I thought, front page of the New York Times, Governor Cuomo and the legislatures are finally, sounds like, getting some momentum to do this after talking about it for a while in the state of New York and cities. So,
and I think
Billy, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, this is going to really open up the floodgates in the U.S. I mean, many of our large cities have seen high occupancy vehicle lanes as a form of congestion pricing, but that's just a small sliver of the possibilities when we think about movements towards car-free downtowns and central cities, and we'll talk a little more about that. But this is we're at the tipping point now of peak congestion, and one of the ways that we'll be able to address that long term is to think about pricing. And one of the things that really is worth more discussion and will be more discussed even beyond congestion zones in New York and San Francisco and LA, extending on Stockholm and London example, is really this idea of, well, then how do we price the curb, and can we start to actually price every drop off? And that's really formative, and there's a lot of research kind of exploring that right now. But I think it's something that designers and planners can really anticipate, and they can lead on as well.
I think one of the other considerations that Billy began to touch on the curb, but I think as we think about implications on our right-of-way and implications on land use, that really need to make sure that design and policy is rethinking parking. And so we're already beginning. I think it's widely known that the AVs have the opportunity to drastically change our parking demand. We're already seeing potentially some of that, even with some some of the shared transportation. But we're also seeing policies policies in cities that you wouldn't expect that are writing some creative policies that are eliminating parking minimums, using dynamic pricing, sensors, and other things like that. I like to use, being from Detroit, I like to use examples of cities like Buffalo that has implemented some rapidly changing parking policies. And this goes both ways, right? I mean, I think that the idea of kind of eliminating parking minimums is one way to think about it, especially in some of our lower dense areas. But in some of our more urban areas across the country, starting to think really intentionally about parking maximums as the way to get at this from a land use perspective. And I think this really begins to open up opportunities as we think about what then highest and best use of land is to meet goals at a city scale. I think as we think about this design and policy, we also want to ensure that we're rethinking what we do with potentially extra space perhaps in our cities. And so the amount of space dedicated to right-of-ways in our cities is astonishing when you begin to think about it. We've already seen great examples of cities, both in the U.S. and abroad, that are repurposing space for pedestrians. I think one of the things that we're interested in is that both the autonomous technology, smart technologies, may allow this to happen in more ephemeral ways, which really allows us to think about our cities in different ways, even throughout the day or different days of week. There's been great momentum in many of our cities to kind of emphasize Vision Zero policies, and so let's use that momentum to build on design principles that focus on improved human health. Much of the literature, there's a lot of disagreement out there, but not much disagreement that autonomous vehicles actually have the potential to make pedestrians safer, help pedestrians be safer with the right design implications. And so let's make sure that we're following Sweden's example and many of the U.S. examples like New York City that's on the cover, and many of the communities you live in, I'm sure, have already advanced some Vision Zero principles. But I think this is important to keep on our forefront.
I would just add, Michael, that it's important also that we don't let the AV dialogue hijack the discussion about health. As we titled this talk, and I think we talk about these systems as interoperable, right? You can't have our rail systems are systems of that support biking and walking. Are also important. We don't fully understand the implications of electrification of bikes as a last mile solution and electrification of scooters as a last mile solution. We don't fully understand the implications of collisions between moving electric e-bikes and e-scooters and slower moving traditional vehicles, as well as the interaction between pedestrians. And I think those are all things that engineers and designers and planners really have to be attentive to when we're considering these health factors.
The final 2 points that we want to make on kind of these, as we start to frame some guiding principles, is one that I think there's a lot of fear around broaching these kind of conversations, but making sure our cities have an active role in deciding what their role wants to be as it relates to data. And how we kind of lead conversations to allow better partnerships between technology companies and develop kind of these innovative win-win partnerships. And Billy's been on the forefront of a lot of these discussions, especially in the Bay Area. And then finally, we kind of touched on land use, but I think all too often we talk about the impacts on right-of-ways without talking about, adjacent land use policies. And I think that we can't separate these things, and we need to do these things now. And it doesn't always require, a multi-million-dollar zoning code rewrite of an entire city. This is example on the screen is a project that we just completed in Detroit that was a Knight Foundation funded effort to reimagine, Detroit's underutilized commercial corridors by doing some creative testing zones that reduce red tape for developers at the same time as kind of creating some zone-wide policies that start to lead us to better conversations about how to transition into a more autonomous future. And so before I kick it back to Billy, I just wanted to stay on Detroit for a second and go through a couple of the things that, may not be too dissimilar to some of the projects that you all are working on in your cities. But this is Detroit. This is underutilized commercial corridor on Kercheval on the east side, and through some planning processes and honest dialogues, these streets are clearly underutilized, and having opportunities to partner with the city, with philanthropic organizations, and with developers to do more things with the right of way. I think if we zoom out from the kind of larger narrative in Detroit right now, this is the city that has identified as the motor city and the birth of the automobile, to kind of the epic icon for urban decay and decline, and is now really becoming a multimodal leader, thanks to some great leadership from folks like Mark De Laverne in the mayor's office, Janet Zatarian in the planning department, who have said we have more road than we need, and let's do something more with it, even in advance of any certainty on what the technology may lead to. And so, some of the work that's happening in the city has led to a kind of a framework, the future city discussion about, how do we ensure in a level, a city of Detroit that we hope is leveling off at 750,000 residents. We can think about a sustainable future that emphasizes the corridors, utilizes multimodal as a backbone in essentially a city that has never doubled down on transit and has been kind of the icon of ubiquitous commercial corridors that are vacant and underutilized. Repurposing some of those adjacent lands and reframing vacant land as an asset, and then building some neighborhoods around that in a 50-year time frame. In essentially a zero growth population. And this is, what some of that looks like, being honest about how we can adaptively reuse our industrial infrastructure to create, multimodal and health-driven outcomes that build community and establish a kind of, character of the city. Taking those small wins, like you just saw at the DeQuinder Cut, and scaling that up at the city scale. The city just announced plans to build a 30-plus mile greenway using adaptive spaces across the city, named the Joe Louis Greenway. And then, as Billy mentioned before, not waiting for the technology, but using the street now as a testing ground, as a fertile testing ground. So companies like May Mobility can come in and actually run autonomous shuttles to serve some of Dan Gilbert's employees, some of his Quicken Loans and Bedrock employees that are now in downtown. This is some public-private partnership money connected to the automotive industries as well. And then the leadership at the city taking a stance and saying we need to do better with our streets. And so the city of Detroit, which 10 years ago had, I think, 1 mile of protected bike lanes, has now gone from one of the last cities on the list in the U.S. to one of the top 10 by building more than 100 miles of protected facilities because of the mode split outcomes to serve residents in an equitable way and drive improved health outcomes as well.
So I get the pleasure of kind of being able to take us big again. And part of my work has always been to challenge the status quo on, well, where do we go from here? And what can we control and what can we rethink to really enliven and I think that when we think about as we innovating our cities, and one of the things that I think that in the APA and the AIA Code of Ethics is really about improving lives and about making a place better. And so, you know, part of what I like to think about is if we control our streets, we control our right-of-ways, maybe we can learn from places that are doing streets differently, that are innovating in a different way. I do a lot of work in the Netherlands, and you know, we talk about places in Amsterdam and Utrecht, but it's nice to see them as exemplars. And this is a street in Delft that I spend a lot of time on when I'm over there doing research, and it has many of the corollaries that we talk about when we talk about envisioning safe and slow and sustainable downtown streets in many of our U.S. cities. And I think we can hold those up as being a future. I have worked for a long time on this intersectionality of technology and planning and governments. And one of the tools that we have been using recently when we've been working with communities is Restreet, and that's just one ability. You know, that just gives us an ability to work with communities and harvest data to rethink the street. And so we recently worked on this with a project with the University of Oregon and their Urbanism Next group, and particularly that's with a gentleman, Professor Mark Schlossberg and Professor Nico Larco. And we really distilled down kind of this idea of rethinking the old idea of a street to 3 principles. And if you there's a report on this that's posted on the Urbanism Next website, and I think it lands us up in this place that blends design and management, and that's been not only a theme for me personally, but I think it's a theme that planners can hold on to. That if we manage our streets better, maybe we can think about thinning the lanes and capturing space. And so, if you can capture some of that space in the residential streets, then what does that mean? That's the space that can be reallocated from a physical real estate standpoint, from a right-of-way standpoint, to other uses. And if you remove the parking, then you have all a further opportunity. And then long term, I think that many of our streets really need to move towards this vision of thinking shared. We know that much of our mobility formats are becoming what we call shared use mobility. They're becoming shared versus owned vehicles. And what if our streets became more shared, just like the streets that we do see in places like Delft or Utrecht or Amsterdam or Copenhagen? And then if we nudge the needle further, maybe we're not even thinking bold enough. Places like Barcelona are already exploring kind of every other street becoming something else, a large linear park. And this is their new rendition of super blocks that support multimodal travel, but also support new forms of built environment infrastructure, whether or not it's ecosystem services or planted area or fields or even housing in many of our superstar cities with acute housing issues. So at the end of the day, I think it's the intersectionality between these issues that really create this urgency and this actionability that we need to harness. And whether or not we're talking about it's important lesson now is that we need to act, and we can't talk about transport without talking about these other factors, whether or not they're housing or climate or finance or equity or education or jobs. And at the end of the day, it really is about getting a game plan for action. So with that, I think I'll just leave with a a challenge that, part of our challenge here is a design challenge, but it's also doing what we do as planners. It's really thinking about risk taking and partnership, which Michael influences, but it's also continuing to build trust and a common language with our public. And so, Michael and I have other resources. We've referenced some of them, and including a book that we both worked on. And there's many other authors as a part of this book, Disruptive Transportation. We talked about the PAS report that's available to you if you're an APA member, as well as a handful of other resources, including the resources from today's webinar, which will be available online afterward. So with that, I think Michael and I will turn it back, and we're available for some questions.
Great. Thanks to both of you for that presentation. We do have one question, and I certainly have something I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on. But if anyone else has questions, please do submit those, and we'll get them. We'll talk about them. One question that came in was do you know of any examples of policies that require public transportation infrastructure, such as sidewalks or ADA access, for new development?
Yeah,
Michael, do you want to go ahead, Michael?
Jenny, I can jump in, and Billy can certainly augment that conversation. I mean, I think there are a lot of good examples out there, and I see the asker of the question is from Hamilton, Ohio, and so I think a lot of the examples tend to be pretty urban in some of our big cities. But maybe what I'll offer out there is some of the work that our firm's done recently in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There's a downtown streets plan that was DDA sponsored in Ann Arbor. Again, Ann Arbor's a small college town of about 100,000 people that began to mandate and require not only streets for different modalities, but also the right kind of infrastructure for pedestrian safety and accessibility. I also know of an example in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I think Nelson Nygaard led that. Again, Grand Rapids is a little bit of a smaller community. Their plan was called the Grand Rapids Vital Streets Plan. So yeah, those may be the top two that come to my mind that are kind of Midwest oriented and maybe smaller town. So that we don't, because I don't think it's not always translatable from like the Boston complete street plans or some of the stuff that's happening on the West Coast as well. But Boston, Billy, other thoughts to add to that?
Well, I think that I would tend to take this back to development standards, and I know that most cities in California, as a part of their transportation element of their general plan, require that type of infrastructure as a part of the development approval. So, I can cite. I know San Luis Obispo does require, as a part of the conditions of approval, that those types of pieces of infrastructure really require. And so I think part of this is really looking at kind of the nuts and bolts of city planning too, is that does your city have standard conditions? And if we're looking at standard conditions of approval, the things that, John, the things that you're mentioning really are things that probably ought to be in standard conditions of approval. And I think that if we were to kind of nudge that forward, maybe we should even be advancing some of those standards. I don't know of any, for example, any development standards that include infrastructure for pickup and drop off, or require, for example, some type of brokering of space for Uber versus services, TNCs like Uber and Lyft, as opposed to private vehicles, or provides that type of infrastructure. And that's where City of San Francisco has done this pilot with Uber and Lyft. It was a combination of consultants that were involved in that. I believe they have a TRB paper, John. If you want to take a look at that, they presented it in DC as a part of TRB 2019, and I think it's available online as well. And if you want to email me offline, I'm happy to point you in the direction of that link, or to connect you with them to get more information about that.
Great, thanks. Another question was, how does the infrastructure under streets impact these ideas and efforts? So presumably sort of utility lines and whatnot, how does that impact the ability to rethink streets?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and something that we think about a lot. You know, in many ways, some of the Detroit examples that I was citing was still keeping, of course, right-of-way public, and so making sure that we're cognizant of some of the underground utilities. But a lot of the kind of green infrastructure push in Detroit and using kind of vacant land and additional space in roadways to address some of the stormwater issues at a citywide level have actually been very intentional to avoid major stormwater infrastructure improvements that the city might be required to make by the tune of billions and billions of dollars. So I think those are, you know, those are things that we need to think about as planners and designers, especially as we start thinking about, you know, in some of the things, the examples that Billy was noting about killing the street, you know, killing the streets for additional green space or pedestrian space certainly preserves some of those right-of-ways for underground utilities. You know, in some denser communities where you start talking about killing the street in terms of allowing for infill housing or affordable housing or micro-housing or other things like that, certainly needs to be coordinated with what's happening underground as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add it's just hard to answer that without understanding context and scale, and those are kind of two things that we have to consider when we look at this: is specific context and also kind of the scale of the project if we're looking at neighborhood or sub-regional or regional infrastructure projects. But one of the simplest answers, and I think that answer I always come back, is to kind of this idea of embedded carbon. And you think about when we think about our surfacing projects, if we truly want to innovate in a way that's most sustainable, we have to think about the embedded carbon that we're putting down on the ground. One of the most challenging surfaces in terms of carbon production is concrete, and so when we think about how we're thinking about concrete construction as well as laying down pieces of asphalt, which lock us into more of a fixed view of what the street can be, I tend to advise people to think about, you know, softscape as opposed to hardscape, or really considering more of a. There's a reason why we maybe should advocate to more pavers and movable pieces of hardscape in the U.S. And I think one of those is it gives us a lot more optionality in considering what the street might look like, but also considering potential movement with underground infrastructure and or additions, subtractions with underground infrastructure. So some of that really gets to kind of servicing and what my colleague from Smith Group, Michael Johnson, probably deals with on a daily basis.
Great. And I think we had another question come in from Florida that I think is sort of related in some ways, and Detroit might be a good example of this, but maybe you can speak to it. But the question is, do any of the initiatives account for water harvesting or stormwater infrastructure improvements within urban areas? So do you see that as part of this discussion of rethinking roads?
Yeah, I absolutely, and I know Billy can add to this as well. I mean, I think one of the organizations that was mentioned that I sit on is the Landscape Architecture Foundation, and you know, we've been really dedicated to improving or proving kind of landscape performance metrics within our public spaces, and I think much of that writing has to do, and much of the thinking has to do with you know, how are water, right? And I think water is such a different thing, you know, bioregionally in each of our communities, and you know, the policies and the designs that we need to think about certainly have city scale implications in many of our cities, but they also need to be thought of at the site level and the street level as well.
I'm gonna, Mr. Rodriguez, I don't want to mispronounce your first name, so I suggested Seattle's a great example. Some of the stuff that they've done with low impact developments is fantastic. And I think maybe this is an opportunity also to pivot to one of the other the questions from Carla from York. Carla, I think there are some good examples of people that are advancing policy that kind of deals with these infrastructure issues from a water and a sustainability standpoint, but also kind of tries to harness the best of the best in terms of how we re-envision streets for new mobility. Rather than go through them, because I think there are great, I mean, I really like, Portland has always been a great city, but with their, it's called the Portland Savvy Initiative. They've done a great job with looking at autonomy as well as new mobility, including like dockless bikes and dockless scooters. So I would suggest that as a starting point. But I'm gonna post a link here in the to the benchmarking study that if you don't know that I published this benchmarking study with Planet is in every year. Every other year, excuse me. We did inventory a number of cities that are looking at that have new mobility policy on the books. If you go to that link and you scroll towards the bottom, we've identified six cities that have TNC policies on the books that are exemplary, but also 7 cities that are starting to explore, and these are every different size, everything from Port St. Lucie, Florida, to Boston, Massachusetts, to Portland, that are looking at policies to try to think about autonomy. So I put that out there to kind of maybe harness one of the resources that Michael and I and our team and our extended team on is, and something that you can take advantage of after the call.
Yeah, Billy, the one thing that I'll add to that is, I do think a lot of the good examples of policies that we're seeing out there are either transportation related or land use related, and there are very few good examples of things that cross between at that overlap and the intersection. And also, things like architects get a lot of good press for being able to repurpose parking decks and different things like that, right? But I think the intersection of a lot of these things where land use meets the right of way, meets transportation policy is really something that we as planners and urban designers, need to make sure we're right in the middle of.
Well, yeah, keep in mind, everybody, that these are super wicked problems, right? We don't throw that over, in terms of our traditional planning literature around their issue. And so I used the word intersection earlier, but I think we have to really emphasize that. And Michael it was great to bring us back to that point that we can't think about transport without thinking about housing, and we can't think about housing without thinking about transport, and we can't think about either of those things without thinking about jobs, and without thinking about education and all these other super complex urban issues. I like to think that planners can save America. And so maybe that should be our theme for the day, is that, we are collectively going to be the people that really save our country.
Great. Let's see here. I think we had one other sort of question come in, and it's something I was sort of thinking about myself. In my position, I do a lot of engaging with a variety of people and sort of thinking about changes coming to their communities, including roadways. And a lot of times, and you mentioned parking, people often have this knee-jerk negative reaction to getting rid of parking. That I was going to ask sort of how you think through that. But the question that came in from Orlando, Florida is definitely related, and I'm going to read it because I know not everyone can see the questions. It's more of a comment, and she said, it's important to look at all the layers in the transportation system where lanes are reduced or eliminated. There was a local pilot program, again, around Orlando, Florida, for a few months that removed lanes, but signal timing was so poor that delays increased by 5 times. So impatient and unyielding drivers increase pedestrian and bicycle accidents. And it also speaks to building public trust. And so I guess if you have any thoughts on that comment, or if you have good examples of how, that has been addressed in any areas, that would be great.
Well, Della, thanks for the comment. I appreciate it sounds like you may have had to deal with the public on this, so we should probably be giving you a hand clap right now, because these are super emotional and personal issues to many of us. And I've sat on, and I've chaired 2 planning commissions now, and these are tough issues, right? I'm dealing this evening with a residential parking program, an RPP. And this is one of the most complex issues that we face. We all feel like we own the space in front of our house if we live in a single family neighborhood, which is actually not the reality. You don't own that space. And those are the distinct curveballs and challenges that planners have to deal with. And I really appreciate your public trust. I think the issue we're facing here is really this pivot away from LOS. And I think as we're thinking about local pilots, it sounds like what you're doing are these incremental pilot programs. It sounds like everything wasn't totally in sync, and maybe there was some disconnects between engineering and planning. And when I look across cities, by and large, many times it's not a planning issue. It's a structural management issue where engineering is housed separately from planning, and so we'll do half the problem. We'll do what you said. The signal time will be off, so that the project isn't as successful as it should have been, or we haven't fully thought through the perhaps the intersection between people that bike and walk and travel. So I guess what I would do is just underscore that the wicked nature of some of these problems, and I think this deals with what you're bringing up, really deals with the complexity of some of this. And yes, we have to dialogue and fully consider all the implications, but that doesn't preclude these little small micro experiments. Clearly, I haven't looked at the data from your experiment, but I would say we have to keep experimenting. And one of the cautions we have is that technology firms are encouraged to take risks, and that's how they have innovated and improved our lives. But private sector entities, they've never been allowed to take risks. And this is where we need to encourage these types of risks. So as long as we're not allowed to be able to innovate our cities as much. So despite it sounds like this was a challenging experiment, I would say we have to continue these kinds of micro experiments to build that public trust in that we and kind of innovate our cities. I didn't deal with the parking thing, but I want to let Michael chime in if he's got anything else to add.
No, I think that was a good answer, and the one thing, this may not be completely applicable to the exact example in Orlando, but Billy, one of the things that I'm struck by as you and I have been working together is, and there's several that are doing this across the country, but making sure that as we're having these holistic conversations, that speed is a really important factor in how we're talking about space of our streets and use of our streets, because even in the interim, a lot of these kind of mode splits that we're talking about will require more space, especially when we're talking about dedicated space, and we really need to start thinking about getting speeds to the level that are humane and walkable and livable, so that we can encourage sharing where that's appropriate, I think that's a big consideration that I think begins to pivot some of our thinking again as part of these holistic conversations. It's not just about painting lines on roads and things like that. So,
and maybe speaking of pivot, what we can do from that is really pivot to this idea of part of this this spirit of risk taking is really about changing the perspective of planners to not being to take in customer driven standpoint, to view outcomes from the perspective of the customer. And I think a really good example of this is this parking phenomenon, and that we know that parking is going down in many of our garages, that many people are using shared vehicles and transportation network companies, and that is a financial sustainability issue in terms of urban revenue. We know that we are going to see declining revenue from our on-street parking. How do we begin to take some of those micro experiments, but also in terms of removing parking and rethinking maybe not building that off-street parking structure? And I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest assets that we can harness is actually viewing this outcome from the standpoint of our customers, our citizens, and also really building a common language with them. We speak terribly with our public sometimes. We use acronyms heavily, and we engage in this transportation speak and this planner talk, which is complicated and it is off-putting to our public. And I think that's something that we're building trust with them. Really looking at it from their standpoint, we can help facilitate, reducing parking and thinking differently about our streets.
Great. Well, thank you, both of you again. It's 2:00, so we'll wrap up here. But thanks to Billy and Michael and to everyone who stuck around for today's event. As I said, we've been recording this, and we'll post the recording as well as a PDF of the presentation on our blog site, sustainableplanning.net. Just find the webinars page, and it'll be on there in the next couple of days. But thank you very much.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, everyone.